you very much for the introduction. First of all, I would like to remind you again that we had the comprehensive project and the research question, which was the following: how innovations in planning emerge and how they become mobile, and we translated this, of course, in our case, of how temporary uses were made fruitful for urban redevelopment, how this emerged in Germany, in the German planning system, and how it became mobile. We used the same methods as already Gabriela also explained it. That means discourse analysis of planning journals, and we also conducted expert interviews with the experts on the level of the Federal Republic of Germany, but we had also intense in-depth studies which we conducted in Berlin. This was one case, and the other one in Stuttgart. This, it was not a pragmatic decision to select Stuttgart. This is something which will Thomas Honeck explain afterwards. So let me please now give you some reflections on the historical and also structural backgrounds of temporary uses in Germany, and also to try a little bit a definition, which is not very easy in this case. And then Thomas will go into the material. So from a historical perspective, so this is one of the question. From a historical perspective, long before anyone used the term temporary uses, vacant brownfield sites have been used temporarily in various forms throughout the world. The creation of temporary vegetable gardens on available land by the inhabitants of bombed-out cities in the wake of World War II in order to compensate for supply problems is just one example in Germany, for example, and also in other places of the world. Additionally, the squatting of vacant houses in the 1970s and 1980s in Germany especially applies as a direct predecessor of today's temporary uses. These housing appropriations, with their experimental forms of living, were then connoted negatively by society, if not classified as outright criminal. Nevertheless, since the late 1990s, temporary uses have been purposefully developed or deployed and developed into a planning tool in Germany, especially in the field of urban redevelopment. In the context of urban development, cities frequently struggled when applying classic urban planning methods in dealing with vacant sites, as often these areas could not be used as resources for urban renewal. The unplanned land use by pioneers, that means citizens who adopt vacant land and buildings creatively for new temporary usages, represented an opportunity for new development perspective. To put it in other words, the selective application of temporary uses was a planning innovation which represented a significant break with previous practices. Space appropriations by citizens which were previously considered illegitimate and prohibited were now used strategically, and since 2004 have even been institutionally legitimized by an amendment to the building code in Germany. But what is meant exactly by the term temporary use in Germany? The term is commonly used for vacant brownfield sites and buildings which, after their original use, have been abandoned, are used temporarily for certain projects until the implementation of new planned usages. Temporary uses can be short-term, for example, seasonal, medium-term, or longer-term. There is disagreement regarding the defined time span of temporary uses. The affected locations are often former industrial sites, but also military sites, residential buildings, department stores and smaller shops, or areas marked for urban development. The types of uses range from the realization of events, for example in the fields of art, culture or sports, community cultivation of neighborhood gardens, to temporary residential or commercial uses, for example in the field of gastronomy. These aspects make a universal definition of temporary use difficult to find. The stakeholders of temporary usage include the temporary users themselves, who are often artists, people engaged in the cultural sector, creatives, also freelancers, start-up entrepreneurs or operators of clubs, and who see convenient and affordable use of land or buildings as an opportunity to experiment with project ideas and move towards independence. Also included are the owners of the vacant land or buildings, who take advantage of the fact that temporary users typically care for the sites with a considerable amount of labor, provide protection against decay, neglect, and vandalism, and often ensure a conservation of value. Last but not least, the municipalities have to be mentioned, which benefit from symbolic effects of temporary uses, even if they do not own the used sites. This is also the argument of Ali before. In planning documents, it is discussed that temporary use projects such as gardens and recreational or cultural activities make cities more livable and attractive. They also provide opportunities for innovative activities, often including volunteering. These projects increase citizens' identification with their respective cities or neighborhoods. In some cases, they even attract tourists. Therefore, actors in the field of spatial planning in Germany have particularly supported these usages, often systematically, because they hope for creative impetus for the upgrading of certain areas and urban development. The following will illustrate how temporary usage in Germany emerged as an instrument in planning and how this innovation was established and diffused, and Thomas will do this shortly, but let me now, roughly speaking, give some observations of the structural conditions, the background factors for this development. And this was, one very important was, of course, demographic change since the 1970s, also the deindustrialization processes since the 1980s, and the accompanying shrinking processes that have rapidly and intensively affected particularly Eastern German cities since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and have challenged urban actors to find novel solutions to issues. To these issues. Increasing discourse about the creative city is another part of the background factors. This was sparked by the rise of the creative class by Florida in 2002 and has contributed to an increasingly positive evaluation of temporary uses in connection with urban development projects. Another important precondition was a change in the field of planning itself, where in the 1990s an openness for new and experimental planning tools was sought after, which enabled the participation as well as partnership between the public and the private sectors. As previously mentioned, Thomas will now present some striking details.
Well, I will try to. I want to, or we would like to put the concept and the developments that Gabriela Christmann has just explained into the discussion as a certain pattern of innovation. And the notion from criminals to creatives says it already. We would like to discuss it as a type of reinterpretation and as an embracement of practices that obviously have their roots outside the traditional world of planning. At the same time, they were recombined or combined with more traditional planning tools and practices, such as plan making, for instance. And the notion of reinterpretation says it already. We understand this innovation process as a social construction, as a result of different stakeholders, different motivations, negotiating, an ever-changing result. And in order to reconstruct this process of social construction, we do discourse analysis, as Gabriela already mentioned. Now, we looked at the last 25 years, and as you can imagine, during that time there were lots of different elements and different processes that had an influence on this program, on this whole development. Nevertheless, I would like to point out two important aspects, or two things that were especially striking, especially for this time of emergence, and later on this first aspect of mobility. The first is, although that we looked at the whole of Germany in different places, there was one city that was especially important, and that's the city of Berlin, especially the period in the early 90s, after the reunification. So we understood this situation, let's say, as kind of an innovative niche, as a center for experimentation on this use, that provided special conditions, special norms, special rules, resources, constellations of actors. The second point is, relates to the organizational dimension of the innovation process. And here we found out that there was one particular group of, let's say, urbanists that advocated this practice and emerged out of the context of Berlin. Now, these 2 points serve really well also to point out the connections between the time of the emergence, let's say, so to say, more initial phases, but also with the later phases, for instance, the mobility, or to the phases when the practice became more mobile. Now, I'd like to invite you to a little journey in time, and let's go to the early 90s in Berlin. Of course, the city's history was very turbulent in the last century, and it's very difficult to make a point. But this situation, or this period of time, right after the reunification of the city, was especially important. On the one hand, I mentioned the special resources. Here we had the special spatial resources, a lot of vacant sites, for instance here the wall strip, but also the unclear ownership structures. And here I have an example from Berlin Mitte, from the working class areas built during the industrialization. But also the political setting, the institutional setting was very special. The old order broke down, so to say. The new one hadn't established at that point. So this created a certain tolerance towards practices that wouldn't have been tolerated under, so to say, more normal circumstances, or more stable circumstances. And in the city, I have to explain that, the city was already before the reunification, on both sides, some kind of an assemblage point for actors or people with more alternative lifestyles. And one part of that was also the squatting movement. And when the Iron Curtain was opened, many people of the squatting movement discovered the eastern part of the city due to its very special circumstances. Now, what is really important for that moment is the notion of conflict. The word criminal says that. Gabriela mentioned it also. Now, these pictures that you see here shall give you an impression of a very certain event that was very important for the process, as we found out in the discourse analysis in the interviews. It was the eviction of Mainzer Straße. It was one street in Friedrichshain that was heavily squatted, and as a fact, it was, or as a matter of fact, it was the largest police operation after World War II. And you can see that in the picture on the right. So there's no civil war, that's an eviction of the street. And it didn't stay without consequences. Right after this, you could see that there was a political change in Berlin. There were people stopping, or politicians stopped, other ones started, but also they reinvented old programs. For instance, the self-help program for these squatters. On the other side, you could also see that the practice of squatting continued, but in a very different way. Much less ideological and politically motivated, and rather a cultural orientation and, so to say, an orientation into art, or in art. And I brought a couple of quotes to show you, to give you a little idea about that time, and that were kind of emblematic for a lot of interviews. One person said, suddenly there was this second town, with very different parameters than West Berlin, and of course West Germany. So that was reflected many times, this notion of difference and, so to say, possibilities that wouldn't have been given in other areas. Another person said, there was nothing else but Mitte, Berlin Mitte. This experience, living it, there was something new everywhere, every week, on every roof, and in every toilet. Well, don't blame me for the last point, he was really emphasizing it. But it showed a certain vision towards the city, and that was even more emphasized in another quote. Not temporary use in the sense of a fancy contract, but a type of practice, the perspective on a city without many barriers. And that's what was important for that time. This perspective that towards the city and a new type of perceiving, so to say. Now, what you can observe in the mid-90s is that there were many communities of practice among temporary users, first. They also had few formal institutionalizations, for example, artist associations, which made them able to receive funding by foundations, for instance, or the cultural office of Mitte. And you could see that also these projects gained initial support, mostly by key figures that were situated in a very important position. For instance, there was one lady that who was working for the housing association Mitte, and she was responsible for the distribution of space of these, so to say, unclear ownership flats. And you could see that the idea was already reflected in the media. There's one, for example, headline from Der Spiegel, which is a very famous German magazine, and it said, everything seems possible. So there was kind of a poetic, even, so to say, enthusiastic language, which was very much in contrast to the, let's say, more desperate and negative language of the shrinking city discussion, or of the discussion how to re-establish or revitalize the old industrial cities. Nonetheless, we don't see any connections to urban development at that point by what happened in Berlin Mitte. So I would like to show you, and even less, it was, you could imagine at that time that the practice would one day become part of the local business promotion in Stuttgart. That's what we found out, and Gabriela has mentioned. Now, I'd like to show you this chart, and it's one of the results of our quantitative analysis. And we wanted to find out about the attention in planning journals in Germany towards temporary use. And what is interesting is this rise of attention in the 2000s. You can see that afterwards the idea seems to establish. So the question is, what happened at that time? And there's the point where this new generation of urbanists comes into the game. Inspired by the situation in Berlin, there was a new, so to say, group of people who somehow were related to the discourse or to urban discourses, who created, first of all, a vocabulary on the idea of temporary use, who then formed or was very, very talented in giving the right narratives, what Patsy emphasized this morning, positive notions on the idea. But also they would link the idea to the mainstream discourses. For instance, on urban regeneration, that was largely discussed in Germany during the Iber Emscher part already, or later on the creative city, an international influence. And interestingly, this, so to say, group of urbanists, I don't say planners, because they created some kind of a new urban field of urban work along the intersections of architecture, planning, art, activism also, and research. And to this end, they could act as intermediators, as they had connections to different stakeholders, so to say, had the institutional knowledge, and could intermediate between people, stakeholders with very different agendas. And another aspect is that we found a certain type of actor very typical for this generation, and we call them the academically oriented practitioner for the moment. People who carry out projects of temporary use, but also have some type of education in planning, or at least some relation to the idea, and combine that with these projects. At the same time, they reflect, they write about their experiences, they conduct research projects. Andrew mentioned the project Catalyst. And they also had alternative forms of communicating the idea, for instance by temporary use projects or on social media. Now, one interesting project was in 2004 and 2005, the temporary use of the Palast der Republik, the former GDR government building. Now, 14 years after the reunification, they, for instance, flooded the basement, and you could go in plastic boats, have sushi at the same time, and listen to classical music. And I can imagine that if we would have the chance to go there tomorrow together, you might talk about it to your friends and colleagues. So, of course, these formats inspired peer discussions and somehow promoted also the practice. Also gave very interesting narratives to it. Now, getting to the conclusions, 0 minutes. We had the developments, or this, so to say, Berlin as a very important place in these developments. We have the new generation of urbanists. And it's interesting to see, although I now focus on these very early developments, that at later stages, you still see a very, very heavy influence of this group. They carried the discourse to other places. They are somewhere involved in Stuttgart, also in Düsseldorf. They scale it also up. They teach at universities. Some of them are nowadays working in the board of foundations or of IBAs. And also the city of Berlin remains emblematic for the practice. And that's a very interesting point. Because I have to tell you that in 2008, the situation in Berlin changed dramatically. The pressure on the real estate market was rising immensely, and it wouldn't permit temporary uses in the sense as it did before. And also you can look at other cities and see that the idea is much more and much stronger institutionalized than in Berlin. Nevertheless, other cities orient at policies that have in fact never existed in Berlin. So what we have is some kind of a blurry image of a golden age, the myth of a golden age of temporary use, that still is just discursively reproduced. So, thank you very much.